The man who vanished into the forest. The hunt for Lázaro Barbosa. On the morning of June 9, 2021, police officers were called to a rural property in Ceilândia, on the outskirts of Brasília, Brazil's capital. At first, the call sounded like many others. A possible home invasion, a family not responding, something suspicious reported by relatives. But when officers arrived and stepped inside the house, what they found immediately changed the scale of the situation. 3 members of the same family were dead. The father and his 2 teenage sons had been executed inside their own home. There were signs of extreme violence, signs of panic, signs that they had no chance to escape. And then there was something even more disturbing. The mother was gone. She hadn't fled. She hadn't called for help. She had been taken. Somewhere outside, beyond the walls of that house, beyond the dirt roads and scattered farms, there was a man moving through the landscape. He was armed. He was experienced. And he had already killed. Over the next 20 days, more than 270 police officers would enter the forests and rural communities surrounding Brasília, supported by helicopters, drones, and tactical teams. Schools would close. Families would abandon their homes. Entire communities would live in fear, because they weren't just looking for a suspect. They were hunting a man who knew exactly how to disappear. His name was Lázaro Barbosa, and for nearly 3 weeks, he made himself into a ghost. Long before the manhunt began, Lázaro Barbosa had already built a reputation with law enforcement. Born in 1988, he grew up in rural regions of central Brazil, areas defined by isolation, poverty, and limited opportunities. From an early age, he was described as withdrawn and unpredictable, someone who struggled to maintain stable relationships and who spent long periods alone. At 19 years old, he committed his first known double homicide. He murdered 2 men in a violent attack involving blunt force. The crime was shocking not only for its brutality, but for his apparent lack of hesitation. He was arrested and later underwent psychological evaluation. Experts warned that he showed strong traits associated with psychopathy, including emotional detachment, lack of remorse, and a high risk of violent reoffending. He was sentenced to prison, but prison did not contain him. In 2007, he escaped. This would become a pattern repeated throughout his life: arrest, escape, disappearance, and return to violence. Over the following years, he was accused of multiple crimes, including robbery, assault, and rape. His preferred targets were isolated rural homes, where families lived far from immediate police response. He would enter quietly, often at night, using knives or firearms, relying on surprise and intimidation. He learned how to control people through fear. He learned how to survive outside the system. And most importantly, he learned the terrain. The forests, rivers, and rural backlands of Goiás became his refuge. He could move through them without roads, without maps, without leaving obvious traces. He knew where to find water. He knew where to hide. He knew how to wait. By 2021, he was already a wanted man, but no one yet understood how far he was willing to go. The crime. In the early hours of June 9th, he arrived at the Vidal family property. Investigators believe he had been watching the house. The property was located in a rural area surrounded by vegetation, separated from neighboring homes by distance and darkness. It was the kind of place where people felt safe, precisely because it was isolated. Inside the house were 4 people: Claudio Vidal, his wife Cleonice, and their 2 sons, aged 15 and 21. At some point during the night, Lázaro entered. He was armed with a firearm and a knife. What followed happened quickly. Claudio and his sons were shot and stabbed inside the house. Evidence suggested they were caught off guard, likely confronted before they could react or escape. The level of violence indicated not only intent to kill, but intent to dominate. Cleonice was taken alive. Before losing access to her phone, she managed to send messages to family members. She told them a man was inside the house. She told them he had killed her family. She told them she was being taken into the forest. Those messages were the last communication anyone would ever receive from her. Days later, her body was found in a wooded area. The manhunt officially began. But what police didn't realize yet was that this would not be a search measured in hours. It would be measured in weeks. The hunt begins. As news spread, fear spread with it. Residents in rural communities began locking themselves inside their homes at night. Others chose not to stay at all. Some families packed their belongings and left, unsure when it would be safe to return. Police mobilized on a massive scale. More than 270 officers from multiple agencies joined the search. Helicopters flew overhead daily. Drones scanned the forest canopy. Armed teams moved on foot through dense vegetation under extreme heat. They were searching for one man, but he kept moving. Reports began to emerge from residents who claimed their homes had been invaded. In some cases, food had been taken. In others, vehicles were stolen. In at least one incident, a family was held hostage inside their own home. The descriptions were consistent. He was calm. He was controlled. He did not appear desperate. He appeared comfortable. This suggested something critical to investigators. He was not simply running. He was surviving. And he was doing it well. He was always one step ahead. What began to unsettle investigators was not just the violence of the crimes, but the pattern that emerged afterward. Because again and again, police units would arrive at locations where he had been reported, sometimes within minutes, sometimes within an hour. And yet every single time, he was already gone, leaving behind only fragments of his presence: an empty food container, a discarded piece of cloth, footprints that stopped abruptly as if the earth itself had swallowed him. And this created a growing sense among officers that they were not simply chasing a fugitive, but chasing someone who understood them, someone who anticipated their movements, someone who knew how police think, how they search, how they close in, and more importantly, how to avoid being closed in at all. Because he did not move like a man in panic. He moved like a predator that knew its territory, choosing when to advance, choosing when to hide, choosing when to vanish. Residents began reporting something even more disturbing, because several witnesses claimed that he had been watching them long before revealing himself, that he would remain hidden in the vegetation for hours, sometimes an entire day, silently observing routines, learning patterns, studying habits, waiting for the precise moment when vulnerability was highest. And this level of patience was not common among ordinary criminals, because desperation creates mistakes. Desperation creates noise. Desperation creates speed. But he showed none of those things. He showed restraint, calculation, and control, and that made him far more dangerous. Some officers would later say that it felt like he was not running randomly, but moving with intention, as if every step had already been planned long before the manhunt even began. The spiritual dimension. As the days passed, something else began to circulate among certain members of the search teams, something that was never part of official reports, something that did not appear in press conferences, but something that quietly affected the psychology of the men who were risking their lives in the forest. Because some officers began to believe that there was more involved than just physical survival, that there was something about him that went beyond training, beyond instinct, beyond experience. One officer would later describe an incident that stayed with him, explaining that his unit had entered a rural property where they believed the fugitive might appear. A property belonging to a family that had previously received death threats from him, and the family had fled in fear, leaving the house empty, allowing police to use it as a temporary base. And when the officers entered, they found something that none of them expected, because inside the house, there were exactly 9 beds prepared, one for each officer, and on each bed, placed carefully, was a medal of Saint Benedict, a religious object traditionally associated with protection against evil. The officer said that at that moment, he felt something he could not explain logically, because it was as if the family had prepared that place not just for shelter, but for protection, as if they believed the threat they faced was not only physical but spiritual. And he admitted that until that moment, he had seen the fugitive only as a criminal, but standing there, looking at those medals, in that silent house, in the middle of a region where fear had driven families away, he began to feel that they were confronting something darker, something that had affected everyone it touched. There were also stories about letters the fugitive had written while in prison years earlier, letters where he spoke about revenge, about destiny, about forces guiding his life, and whether those words reflected belief, manipulation, or psychological instability was never fully determined. But what mattered in that moment was the effect those stories had on the officers who were walking into the forest every day, not knowing if they would be the next to encounter him. Because fear is not only created by what you see, fear is created by what you cannot explain. The pressure builds outside the forest. The entire country was watching, because the manhunt had become national news, broadcast daily, debated by commentators, analyzed by experts, and questioned by the public. And with every passing day that he remained free, the pressure on law enforcement increased because people began asking how one man could evade hundreds of officers for so long, how one man could disappear in a region surrounded by roads, helicopters, and armed patrols, how one man could make the system look powerless. But what the public did not see was the reality on the ground, because the terrain was vast, covered in dense vegetation, filled with abandoned structures, caves, and natural hiding places, and every movement required caution, because he was armed, and he had already proven that he would not hesitate to kill. Officers slept little. They ate irregularly. They walked for hours under extreme heat. And still, there was no capture. Some began to question whether the hunt would ever end. The final days, by the 20th day, something began to change. Reports indicated that he was becoming more desperate, more visible, more willing to take risks because survival in the forest requires resources, and resources eventually run out, forcing movement, forcing exposure, forcing mistakes. On June 28, 2021, police received information that he had been seen near a rural road. Units were deployed immediately. This time, the outcome would be different. Officers moved into position, surrounding the area carefully, closing possible escape routes, reducing the space where he could move. And for the first time in 20 days, the distance between hunter and hunted disappeared. Shots were fired. When it was over, he was on the ground. The man who had vanished into the forest was finally found. The manhunt was over. Aftermath, his death ended the immediate threat. But it did not end the questions. How had he survived so long? How had he stayed ahead for so many days? How had one man created so much fear? Some answers existed in his past. Some answers existed in the terrain. And some answers, for those who were there, remained beyond explanation. Because long after the helicopters left, long after the search teams went home, long after the forest became silent again, the story remained. Not just as a manhunt, but as a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who know how to disappear.